book that I sent to you. Partly because it's one of the few very straightforward written things on pieces of text, but just on sanitization and how things are, what different sanitizing agents are. It does certainly focus on things that not everybody's using, but it's not a bad idea to mix things up a little bit. I mean, a lot of wineries I know, a lot of wineries just hose things off and say that's clean. There's a famous guy, Abe Schoner. Has anybody had the wines from like McCravis and stuff? It's Sculling Project from they're in like Sassoon Valley in California. My wife's from Vacaville, so we always have to go through there. But Sassoon Valley, like all these old grapevines, they've got this crazy guy who's making like 16% alcohol white wines and skin fermented and stuff. And he goes, we just hose it down and it's clean, it's perfect. But I mean, if you're using, like we mostly use ProxyClean and peracetic acid. So you use a base, and you use a rinse and a sanitizer. We'll talk about that. But and that works really well. But there's lots of other cleaning agents that you can get for use in other situations, or depending on what your target microbe is. And a lot of the time, you don't necessarily know exactly what it is. You just assume they're all there. So have at it. But I think this is a really well put together portion from a guy that's actually a microbiologist, which is also nice because it's not like somebody who's good at scrubbing things is making this decision. It's actually a guy that knows exactly what, they do the thing where, how hot does it have to be before we've cooked up all these bacteria? So a lot of, everybody goes that, or sanitizing bottling lines, everybody goes back to these papers where it's like, well, how hot does hot have to be? It's like 180 degrees. So I think this is that chapter from the Charlie Edwards and.
You said you posted it?
I did post it, didn't I? Chapter 11 and 12. Oh, Francis. Oh, I will do that.
That's why I opened this thing up, because it was like, maybe I missed it.
No, I'll do that. I'm sure I did that. But I did post the class notes, right?
Yeah, the class notes were posted.
Well, that's too bad. Now I don't have any excuses. I thought they were on the class note page. No, that was last week that there were two.
Yeah, a lot of.
Oh, it was the biogeography of organisms thing.
Yeah, those are up there.
Those are there.
Monkey. All right, I'll take care of that. That's fine. Everything that you will need to know is in the slide. But if you want more information, it's in the thing. So, well, good. I was worried that you were going to be reading along, but I'm basically just reading out of a book. So
he memorized it.
Anyway, so I think just in terms of looking at wineries, talking about a little bit, what's dirty, what's making it dirty, because there's all sorts of different films and sludges. How clean is it our goal to get this thing? This idea of clean versus sanitized versus sterilized. It'd be nice if we could close the doors on the winery and just autoclave the whole place. It's bad for the wine, but it's really bad for the organisms and stuff. So we have to talk about, but what's the actual goal? Most of the time we're just trying to control populations of stuff, which is why it's good practice to clean the floors, and it's good. The floors, this is the thing. People want to get into their tanks to clean their tanks. It's like the only part of your body that is touching the tank at all times when you're standing in a tank is the part of your body that is touching the floor all the time. And there's nothing dirtier than the floor. So people take their boots, they get in the tank, they scrape all the dirt from the floor into the little stainless steel cracks in the tank. And they feel like they're cleaning the hell out of the wall up there where the wine's not even going to get to it, and they're standing right on the bottom of the tank. On top of it being dangerous, just from a safety standpoint. It's one of those things like think through the process, and it's why I like listening to microbiologists talk about this rather than other people, because it's rather than technicians. This is a kind of a problem in the wine industry, and we've talked about this a little bit in the previous science classes, Intro to Wine Science, where there's a lot of kind of popular experts about how things go, why wines get reductive when you use screw caps. And the most famous book on that is written by a bottling wine technician, not by a wine chemist. And so he writes this huge chapter on why wines go reductive under screw cap, and it's wrong. his chemistry is poor. I mean, the whole thing is, but it's now the only published thing on cleaning stuff. So I'm glad, or on screw caps with reduction. So I'm glad that these guys have done such a nice job. So again, there's parts of it that really won't apply to the products that you use, but it's nice to know the range of things that are out there. So a little bit about cleaning techniques. Safety, particularly with harvest, you're exhausted and everybody makes mistakes when they're really tired. How do we do this? So you don't spray yourself in the face with caustic. We had this guy yesterday, we were cross-flow filtering, he's like, oh yeah, this thing really vents when it runs and pushes out the clean cycle. Man, it really vents. And he's like, sticks the hoses down the drain and turns this like sploosh, caustic up into the air. Like, no goggles, no gloves, pH like 13, like this, go away. And then we'll talk a little bit about quality controls. And I was going through this chapter, and I was like, man, I need to do more of this for our winery. So I guess it's good practice for everybody to look at the idea of quality controls and kind of implementing plans and sticking to it. So it seems very obvious that everything is dirty in a winery. I mean, you have lots of, we're using microbes of all different sorts to get work done, so then they naturally are growing all over all of the surfaces. But when we think about breaking the equipment that we use in the winery down, and a lot of it has multiple uses, but down into several different places, and that sort of thing is, it's very difficult, for instance, inside of transfer equipment to clean the inside of your pump. You don't get in there with a toothbrush and scrub out the inside of your pump. So that's something where you're always forced to use chemicals, and you have to do it regularly enough so that any buildup that happens is dealt with fairly quickly. So hoses, pumps, all the gaskets and fittings, the valves, your buckets become wine storage devices at the end of runs frequently, where you're chasing stuff into a bucket and you're bucketing it up over the top. All of these, that sort of transfer equipment is they're always dirty. They're always holding wine, or they're always holding air, which is also not terribly good for the kinds of organisms that we're usually trying to avoid. We often store our pumps. We have a bucket of proxy and a bucket of peracetic acid, and we store the pumps and the hoses with peracetic acid inside them, especially if we know we're going to be using it really shortly thereafter. And I think as long as you can use a little test strip on the peracetic acid to see, yes, this is of sufficient quality or concentration to kill everything. And so at least in those sort of situations, you don't have, because it's hard to dump the pump upside down and shake out the last little bit of water, so there's always liquid that stays inside of these things. And for instance, when we use the bottling line truck, when we use the truck, we use the truck's pump as well. And so the pump comes off the truck, and there's a little air valve on it that you quick disconnect or quick connect, that you're supposed to push the wine back through the pump and back into the pump or into the truck with air, and it's a ball valve. People don't know how to clean ball valves, so you just, if it's open, closed or open, 45 degrees, when you're cleaning it, you have to have it at 45 degrees to clean behind the ball valve. Everybody just opens it all the way up, sprays directly through it, they put it on the ground, they put it back in the truck, put it on the ground at your winery, open it 45 degrees, and red wine trickles out. Almost every single time that we use this pump. So you get better at cleaning things the more you do it, but it's one of those things, it's crazy that people don't like, wine just rolls right out of these things. So that's why when you borrow something from somebody, or you lend it to them, they give it back to you, just clean it immediately. Before you bring it into your winery covered in whatever thing that they've got for it. Next door neighbor winery sellers.
So is there, actually I want to back up just a sec. Storing hoses, blah, 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 with the acid, does that soften, or is there any impact on any of the rubber impellers or any of the gaskets and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, there is. Yeah. That being said, the low pump that we're using now, we haven't had any problems with it. Those gaskets are pretty hard on those, but I'm sure that the rubber, the front end, wet end seal kit is negatively impacted by that. They're all prone to oxidation, but some are a little bit more durable than others. Think about this. When we were using a rubber impeller pump, which it's a great pump. Probably, over 5 years, I've put one new impeller in there. So it's maybe 60, bucks. Probably pumped a million gallons of wine with that thing. I mean, in terms of like pump overs and transfers back and forth. So, I mean, at least I knew it was clean, even if it wasn't going to live forever. Those pumps are bulletproof. I mean, they fall over on their side, and there's nothing going through them, and they keep running, and you're like, oh, it's hot. Spray it off. It's now cool. Okay, start running wine through it. Kind of tricky. But yeah, there's certainly, and we see this a lot with bottling lines. Everybody wanted to, oh, we'll use ozone. Ozone's a hot new thing. We'll use ozone. And then they come in one day and like there's like the black dust underneath the bottling line where all of their, all of their gaskets and everything have, with the dust. So yeah, some of these compounds are better than others in terms of hardness, or I should say, how kind they are to the equipment being cleaned with them. Certainly wine storage devices, and I did put tanks on here, but all different sizes. Carboys and kegs. Carboys are nice because you can at least see inside them. Kegs are very difficult to see inside of. I mean, you like look at the bottom, and if it's not disgusting, you're like, pretty good. So there's a lot of like, it's going to be fine now. And tanks, of course. Stay out of tanks, is my feeling about that. And barrels. And I mean, all of these things they have downfalls. The worst, of course, is barrels. Because you can get a tank real hot. You can get a keg, with steam, you can clean with steam. Even barrels cleaned with steam, it doesn't take very far before, the organisms can get down into the wood and knock them out. And you really have to work very hard to get those barrels warm enough to kill everything in them. It's very rarely possible. And it's not as though you're putting some kind of crystal clean substance back into the barrel. When you put wine back into a barrel, it's already got its own. So as soon as you put wine into a barrel, it's pretty much as dirty as it was when you started. Maybe if you had a problem with just that one barrel and this is a different wine, say it was pretend Myces or something. But I just think it's very unlikely. So we clean surfaces all the time. We clean floors, we clean concrete. If you're smart, you clean walls. I mean, everybody knows. We stack our fermenters up along the wall, we go through the line and do punch downs, and then every year at the end of harvest, you look and it's like, oh, it's interesting, about this high off the ground, there's red spatter all the way down along the wall, so you have to go back through and clean that. And then very importantly is all of the processing equipment. And this is stuff it's not just cleaning for cosmetics, this is every drop of wine in the winery will go through the press. All of the red wine are very close to it. We'll go through your stemmers, all of your punch down tools, all of your sorting lines, all of your big pieces of equipment. And some of these are very complicated to disassemble, and it's really important that it's in terms of, you don't just put it all on one person's shoulder, that there's really a team effort in terms of setting this thing, getting things clean. Yeah, that's basically it sounds crazy to clean your drains, but it's population control. We're not eliminating an organism from the winery, but we're really trying to control the population, and that does also mean putting some caustic down your drains from time to time, cleaning your sink. I mean, there's a little puddle of water sitting there on everybody's metal sink top counter there next to your sink. That's ends up getting slimy. It's like you just have to scrub all these things down. It's not the most romantic part of the job, but it's certainly it's awfully nice to say, oh, you take your clean fitting off the clean fitting rack, maybe it's clean, then you set it on what? The counter? I mean, we're not doing surgery, but it's also to keep things as clean as we can. Usually, it's not always possible. Maybe you can walk into the winery and you guys are all working hard, learning how to make wine and keep things clean, and there's a little drip spots underneath the back of the tank, and there's a little bit of wine caught up in the gaskets on the back side of the variable capacity tanks. Everybody's seen these variable capacity tanks, right? It has the edge of the lip goes like this, and it comes out a little bit further, and then you've got the balloon that goes around it, and this sits right on top of the wine, and the wall of the tank is right there, and then you invariably get water, or you get wine, and potentially cleaning agent, which is another problem, stuck behind the inflatable gasket there. especially when the wine goes into the tank fairly cold and then it warms up, so it expands a little bit and whoop, right up behind there. It's not as though that gap is so small that microbes can't get in there. I mean, all of these things there's so many good places for microbes to hide. So a lot of the time what we're seeing as being kind of the dirt in wine is actually, you know, just kind of part of the wine or whatever's left of the wine when it dehydrates. But depending on the equipment, if we're talking about pick bins or we're talking about harvest equipment, we'll get a lot of just soil or kind of junk residue, often like along the base of walls and stuff. You'll get that's basically just, you know, soil stuff that comes in from outside. There's a lot of grape proteins. This is particularly true at harvest. I know if you've cleaning out a fermenter after you've fermented in it, there's just kind of grayish red crusty stuff that's kind of all the way around the edge at the top of the fermenter, and that's all of this. It's basically like a grape mousse. So like if you have and really it's what it, I mean, it's protein that gets charged with carbon dioxide basically, and it bubbles up the side of the thing and it turns into this solid foam that you really have to scrub at to get at. And it's very nutritious. It's a great place for organisms to hide. It's one of these compounds that can really get baked on also if it gets heated up too quickly too, so it just kind of cook itself against the wall of the tank. A lot of tartrates, and this is again, you can usually see these and feel these pretty well. It's often what you see on the inside of a keg. So if you ferment, you know, the last little bit of Chardonnay in your keg, and then you clean it out, and hose it out, and the water runs out clean, you go, oh great, it's clean. And then you take your magic flashlight and look in there, and you can see that it's like, you know, some kind of cavern in there with tartrates growing all over the place. Those are a great place for organisms in wine to hide behind that and be inaccessible to other cleaning agents. So it's really important that those are dealt with before you can really clean things. A lot of the time, grape tartrates and phenolics will kind of bind up together. So they'll have, in red fermenter tanks, you'll have red tartrates up against in the walls and things like that there. I think it's the same problem as well. So biofilms, anything that has, I mean, living organisms basically will live on the surface of something and they'll grow a larger population. Again, you can kill that, but it's best to remove that, much like the grape protein. You can heat it up to 300 degrees or you know, whatever, 212 or with steam, much warmer than that. And it's clean dirt, but it's still dirt. So in terms of something that you'd rather have off there before you continue on with your cleaning process. And then just in general, mold, and this is very common on floors and in drains, on countertops. And leaves as well, so which are, I mean, it's its own special kind of biofilm, and then solids also from the wine, from the vineyard, from the dirt from vineyards, all that stuff that kind of gets chopped up during fermentation and sinks to the bottom of your fermentation tank or the bottom of your barrel. So, I mean, all of these different things. There's tons of, and mostly what we see when we look at just kind of a nasty surface is kind of a, you know, sort of like the Chinese lunch menu where you get to choose like 3 or 4 of the options. So cleaning really is a multi-part operation. So I use the word cleaning. Technically what these guys are saying is first you clean, then you sanitize, then you sterilize. So it's really between 2 and 3. So when you're talking about cleaning something, this is where you just hose it off. And like, hose it off, looks pretty good. Okay, it's clean now. So I don't see any more. We've got the junk out of the bottom. And so this is, you know, when you're standing at the top of the tank and chasing that one last berry that's in the bottom of the tank around in circles, like for 5 minutes to, you know, to get it out of there. You're really just trying to get all of the solids, and that'll move out of there just by basically hosing it off with a little bit of pressure. Then you move into kind of a chemistry situation where you're really trying to either break down microbial populations or deposits, so tartrates or something like that. And then when we're moving on to sterilizing, where we're really using, you know, where we're trying to sanitizing, we're really just reducing a population. And when we're sterilizing, like for instance, when we're about to bottle wine, you sterilize the bottling line. You make sure that the entire thing has really no organisms that are surviving on it any longer. And this is, I mean, rarely are we actually sterilizing something. So we have a little bucket of, we have our little sprayers with peracetic acid in them, or sprayers with ProxyClean in them, or something like that. And, yes, we're covering the entire surface. Yes, we're killing a lot of organisms, but it's not as though we actually believe that we've killed everything that's in there. I mean, it's just, this is why, if you have a wine with residual sugar and you filter it into a clean tank, you can't just go to bottle. I mean, there's organisms that are still existing in that tank because really you've only sanitized it. You brought back your inoculation is very small, but there's still some stuff in there. So when we're sterilizing it involves filtering the product and then moving it into something that we know was not just sanitized, but sterilized. And it has to be from where the wine, basically from when the beginning of the filter all the way to the corker. So that every piece of equipment all along the way has to have no cooties on it. And you have to re-filter the wine immediately before it goes into that. So you can pre-filter all day long. So what I was doing yesterday with the cross flow is really just pre-filtering, and it will then hopefully flow through with no problem through sterile membranes on the truck. But and then those are in place for the heat sterilization. Cleaning is a huge part of winemaking. And it feels like, oh my God, really? Are we going to have to hose that down again or scrub this thing again? Your hands are cracked, and it becomes kind of repetitive and very difficult work. But you get to be very good at it. You get your black belt.
So Lynn, if you're doing mechanical corking, manual corking, should you be wearing gloves, or could you just use your hand? What's the danger in that?
There's yeast on everything. That's just, when you're doing manual corking, it is not in any way a sterile process.
Right. But is it a high danger or low danger?
It's high danger. I mean, if you are doing that process with where anybody touches the cork, you will have bottles that re-ferment if there is something that is going on there. Probably. I mean, there's nothing about that would make it sound, basically. So if you're just making a homemade red wine that's gone through malolactic fermentation, and it's just so sugar and malic dry, it's less likely. But if it's, for instance, if it's a Riesling or something or some wine with a lot of residual sugar, you're probably going to have re-fermentation issues. Even if you spray down the corker jaws with acid, or with alcohol, or if you float the corks in a sulfur solution. I mean, even then, you realize that you're reducing populations, but you're not doing a sterile bottle. I mean, it's really tough. I mean, even the situations where, it's difficult to do it. And like Peter's got the rack that goes over the filler spouts and everything. I mean, and that's good. But then of course you pull it off and they're just standing there right in front. I mean, it's not like it's in some kind of enclosed situation. I mean, and even on the bottling lines that we're using, they're going to shift it back a little bit. So it's not like you're spraying wine all over the place. But for instance, when you go to do anything, you have to certainly wear gloves, and you really don't touch the tops of bottles. So when you're putting, like, this is your Riesling bottle going out of the filler, when you dump it on there, don't touch the top of the bottle, because then whatever's on your hand is then on that filler spout, and everything's going through the same corker, going through the same leveler, going through everything. So it's just one of those things. It's very hard. I mean, if you're making a dry wine with a little bit of, with a high enough level of SO2 and a little bit of malic acid, it's going to take a little while, but you could have problems there. It's not a sterile situation. You can do all of the things you want to minimize your risks there, but it's not. You just can't eliminate risk. But it's the hard part about home winemaking. I mean, really. So, and it's the hard part, like magnums and stuff. I mean, we use filtered wines for magnums, but we can't filter if the cork goes in the bottle. I we certainly don't have a sterile way of doing that. So I think that most wineries, I would rather have two 750s than a 1.5 liter of almost anything, because I know the 750s have gone through a very good bottling line situation. Certainly with most of the wineries that I work with, where we also use the same bottling truck and everything like that. I'm very confident in that quality. It's tough. It's just one of those, like, it's clean. This is my favorite picture ever. I don't know if people follow the exploits of Joe Biden on the Onion, but it's just great. I should have put a little onion thing just so it's not an actual picture of Joe. But so it's your purple belt for your first harvest, but you have to cleaned everything like 25 times, and you're getting good at it. But this is, I was talking about this a little bit earlier. It takes a long time, especially with complicated harvest production equipment, where you're taking things apart, they're heavy, you're tired. It's no more or no less, I mean, it's certainly no less important, no matter how tired you are, that you get it very clean at the end of the day. And this is where having one poor person, it's like, oh, we got an intern to do it, go clean that intern. And it's like, even if the intern is like a total robot that feels absolutely no pain at all, after 6 weeks of that, or after a 15-hour day, people do a bad job. And the microbes don't care. I mean, whatever you're trying to clean off there, could care less. So you really have to, it's much better to divide the labor up, to work on things. Everybody has a manageable task and does a very good job at that one part of the task. And then it's very tempting. I know winemakers that are like this, and it's like, I mean, there's certainly wineries that are way too big for that to be occurring. But it's just, in smaller places, which is where most of us work, everybody has to work on stuff, and then you have to get good at it, and you have to show people how to do it a number of times. Because if they just continually miss, you have to go, like, did you clean the destemmer? Yes, but after the first 10 times, you actually do have to go and look, up underneath in the part that you found 3 harvests ago and forgot to tell them about that, yeah, you have to get underneath it like that and spray up at this strange angle. It's a ridiculous skill to master. I mean, it is absolutely of no use at any other part of your life. It's not like, learning Spanish or something. You can go to lots of places and speak Spanish. You just know this one thing about this little crack up inside this one brand of destemmer from 1975 or something like that. So it's really, I mean, it sort of sounds very mundane, but it can really help a lot in the long run, because it's all of those, like whole winery sanitation it is that little spot on every single thing that people don't know how to clean correctly, and taken broadly, that's a lot of dirty stuff. That is something at every point along the line that has problems. So this is why, you just can't, it's very important to get good people that are interested in cleaning it, and when you see that people aren't doing it right, it's like, oh, I just dropped the gasket on the ground for a second. I mean, again, it's not like you're picking up the gasket and like putting it into somebody's, like C-section or something like that. But at the same time, there are more important things in the world than winemaking, but we might as well, keep these things in mind. We aim for the ideal, and we kind of, land somewhere in the middle. So beyond just being tired at harvest, and this is something, I feel like this is one of the bigger parts of my job is, they pay attention to when people are totally exhausted, but be more aware of what could go wrong in the thing that they're doing than they are in some ways. So heat is fantastically dangerous, as we all know. Tons of chemicals that we use are, especially in the part that we dilute to operating strength, the acids and bases that we use are really dangerous. I don't know, does anybody use soda ash or Excel or any of these things that any of the wineries? These are stuff with very high pHs, and they will, my boss has burns down his arm because they were scrubbing the press in rubber gloves, and downhill is still that way, so trickle, trickle, trickle off the glove and onto his forearm, and he's got scars for life from the base burns. So really, really dangerous. Dirty things are also dangerous too. Slippery floors, that area behind the tank where the drip, drip, drip off the condensation from the chiller lines all year long, and you go, oh, well, that's interesting. It's a quarter of an inch of slime on the floor, and then all of a sudden you're looking at the ceiling because you fell on your butt. So things like that are very important to look at. Constantly moving heavy objects, and this is just general workplace hazard. I mean, these things happen. And then toxic gases. SO2 is a big one, especially if you're using SO2 cylinders to gas barrels. But carbon dioxide is really a huge workplace hazard. I dealt with a guy this year from University of Washington who's a workplace safety guy. And he wanted to write a safety manual for small wineries and really talk about controlled entry. Is it like going into tanks or going into environments with low levels of oxygen particularly, or other dangerous gases? And I told him, like, especially in the complex that we're in, depending on the phase, the development phase, there's one up kind of above where Red Sky is, and there's no door in the back.
Right.
And so what if you want to go back there and it's, you're fermenting 25 tons or 40 tons or something in there? Fills up with carbon dioxide. And we ran this overnight. We measured this overnight on 3 or 4 different nights. And we're talking from 360 milligrams, 300 milligrams per liter, parts per million of CO2 in normal, everyday breathing air. And we were up, the machine maxed out at 48,000. And we were over 48,000 before midnight. So coming in the morning, you're well over 40. I mean, and that's the sort of thing where you really only have a few minutes. Like, maybe, yes, you can walk from one door to the other, but his thing is like, you fall and you hit your head and you knock yourself out, you're a goner. I mean, it's unlikely, but, in an environment that already lacks a little bit of air to begin with, these things can be really dangerous. So, that's just not just a cleaning situation, but that's just be sensible. So there's some stuff that you can fix with policies. Nobody enters the winery alone. You open the front door, you walk around the back, and you open the back door. When you're SO2ing barrels, all the doors in the winery are open, and you're wearing personal protective equipment. And that's also key. There's a lot of places that want to skimp on stuff for themselves or be tough and hold their breath while they're SO2ing a barrel. Our neighbors at Guardian do this all the time. It's like, I'm going to hold my breath, and I'm going to SO2 a barrel. And it's like, or you can go down the street, you can buy one cartridge, you can breathe clean air, and then do a good job. Because you think you're doing a great job of what you're doing when you're holding your breath and wondering if you're going to pass out. And it's like, come on. But, not to pick on them, a lot of places do this. And there's a lot of like, well, I'm already working really hard, and I'm already sore anyway, so it's just, even if it's not good for me, I won't die. Like
but maybe you will.
Right, yeah, exactly. And when you're exhausted, you're more likely to make a mistake. And this is not just at harvest, this is all year long, but harvest is the time where the most stuff is happening, and so your chances are getting better and better if something to go sideways on you. But goggles, face masks, so like splash protective stuff if you're really working with something that's dangerous. Ear protection, this is a big thing as well. It's more environmental hazard, but everybody on the bottling line, it's like, after a day walking off that truck, that you're like, you still hear clanging, like, it's hard on it. So rubber boots, so that you can, especially rubber boots are great also for heat, unless you go over the top and then bake your little feet. But you can't be perfect about everything, but certainly it's better than having chemical soaked shoes all day long or wet feet, which is also hard on you. And then gas, so get an acid gas respirator, and theoretically you need a full face mask with that as well, because things like SO2 will dissolve into the liquid on your eyes as well, so you'll have eye burns, things like that as well, which is going to be a problem. So kind of moving on to another chart. This is a little less, but you might die. You could drown yourself. Water really is the most important part of cleaning, because you are using water to both dilute almost all of your cleaning products, and you're using water as the energy source for agitating things. A lot of wineries, and I talked to Mike Janik about this, the only thing that they do to their water at their winery is remove chlorine. and this can be a quality control issue with mold and chlorine on wood. You can end up with aerosols, trichloroanisole, tetrachloroanisole, which are that off aroma from cork taint. Many wineries that have a big well, and I worked at Penarash, and we had a huge well, and they had to have a really sophisticated water treatment system. And places that are out, I know in Eastern Washington have a lot of places that a lot of that is well water as well. And you have to have a pretty sophisticated, and these things are very expensive when you're putting a facility together. For us on the west side, I think most of the time charcoal filters to remove chlorine is most important. Some of those don't work quite as well. But when you have to get more sophisticated stuff where you're really first filtering the water with chlorine and then running it through like a water softening system or something like that, it's really expensive, and it again takes somebody to manage and monitor the whole thing.
I've actually been surprised at how few places even do the chlorine filters. It's just straight tap water, off you go.
Yeah, I mean, we have a tap water filter for like hydrating yeast and stuff, so that we're adding, dechlorinated water to that. But we don't have a water. I mean, I would love that, but Jerry's got one at Guardian. That's a charcoal filter for the water that goes in the place. I think it's not a bad idea. I haven't tested the background for what bleach is at in there, but if you're filling your barrels up with chlorinated water, it's like how chlorinated is it? We used to have some. I mean, it depends also how close to the treatment station you are, I think, as well. And I know that when I was in France, we would have there was this huge flu outbreak, and there was a huge a flood basically, and I don't know whether it was just in the building that we were living in that they just nuked it with bleach, but your eyes would water in the shower. It was so bleachy, and I had a gray shirt that I would jog in, and there was enough bleach left on my skin that where I had sweated through my shirt was bleach. You could smell it. It was wow. It was really very serious. But so that sort of stuff, you definitely run into problems. I don't know. In a perfect world, I would love to have totally filtered water, but I'm stuck here now, at least. Yeah, in Western Washington, we have pretty good water, and maybe dechlorination is really what's necessary. But both in Oregon and in Eastern Washington, you have a lot more problems with harder water, especially. So the first step in this process of creating an object just sparkly and microbe-free is you really have to remove that surface film of whatever dirt or biofilm or tartrates or anything like that, if you can. Some things like tartrates and biofilm, you really need to have a chemical portion of the cleaning as well. But you can get a long ways with a good water pressure in a hose, or particularly with a pressure washer. That can be great. So mostly we're talking about energy from water, so spray balls where it just rotates inside the tank, or your barrel washer, that kind of thing, where you really are knocking off a whole bunch of stuff. And it's surprising, especially with tartrates, just fluctuating between hot and cold water, that kind of expansion, contraction can help to kind of break things off the surface inside of the barrels or off the insides of tanks and things like that. Especially with some of these biofilms, though, you do want to be careful about getting it too hot to begin with, because this is where you'll really kind of burn on those, because you can get, particularly with steam, but also really hot pressure washers, you can really cook that stuff, and it makes it doubly hard to remove.
And if you've done that, is there an easy solution?
Especially if it's stainless or something, you can still scrub it off, but it gets harder to do. It's easier, especially when you're using something. This is why, for instance, ProxyClean is so good, because if you spray Proxy on that stuff, it kind of sinks into that, and just wait a second, and then a soft, and this is important too, so these scrubber pads or bristle brushes that you use really have to be non-metal, basically, is the key part. seen a lot of places where somebody took an SOS pad because it worked great and took both like a filler, like a bottling filler, and or stainless steel fermenters, and it's like just as far down as the arm can reach, there's like big brush circle scratches all the way around the thing. And the downside of that is that they look, you know, it's a big scratch. So you have, in the kind of micro way that it looks, is you have this big scratch on the surface, and you can get things that, I mean, you can get either objects or microbes or other sorts of like cleansing agents and stuff down into there, and they're very difficult to reach with water. I mean, if we're looking at this blown up like a jillion times, so one of those little scratch marks. But a big problem with this is that if you're using like a tenside or something that reduces the surface tension of the water, they can grab onto some of those microbes and it can pull back into some of those cracks, and then when you're trying to rinse it off later on, it's very difficult to get at as well. Also, you're scratching what is the stainless finish on those things, so then you're opening up the possibility of oxidation and rust and things like that. I mean, shiny stainless steel things don't stay shiny and perfect forever, but it's best to, you know, not make a habit of reducing their lifespan. So, also, I mean, mostly you don't see rubber brushes, but there's definitely some of those scrubber pads where the backside of some of those Scotch-Brite pads are not always, they're not always the softer material. Sometimes it's more like colored steel wool or something like that, and that can be pretty bad. So, we use, like I said, I mean, there's a range of different options, but with detergents, particularly these like soap-like detergents, where we're having kind of two different kinds of chemistry going on. So one end that's very interested in water, so it's very polar, and then another end that's much more interested in oils and the non-polar substances. And so this is how soap works. And we talked about this polarity or hydrophobic or hydrophilic chemistry in Intro to Wine Science, and I think it's one of the most important parts for me to understand about chemistry in wine, because you learn a lot about, you know, what's soluble or how you expect things to behave, and I find it useful to think about. And detergents are a good way of thinking about that, or at least soaps. There's other forms of cleansers that we use, but the more traditional kind here is the ones that are working more like that. And really, there's some stuff that's really crazy, high-end, like poisonous stuff, like sodium hydroxide, and there's also potassium hydroxide as well, which are really strong bases. And some places will just use really gentle soaps. And I've known that I've bought tanks, new stainless tanks, several times. The guy's like, first thing you do, just get it sudsy with dish detergent and whatever metal, I mean, little bits of grease or something from the production factory that's on there. It's going to clean that off just perfectly, and then you go about doing your normal sanitization. But it's really pretty remarkable. You don't think about, you know, yeah, it makes sense when you're in the kitchen cleaning glassware with dish soap. But like, try some dish soap on the outside of your fermenter, or try some dish soap when you're cleaning your whole sink area. You do it in your kitchen, but then you don't think about it the same way in the back of the winery, and you're pouring proxy clean on it and scrubbing like crazy, and it's like, yeah, we just put some kind of foamy soap on there and rinse it away. It gets very clean pretty quickly. So, I mean, sometimes we get our mindset you clean stuff all day long in the kitchen, but then you go to the winery and you think a totally different family of chemicals is something that you have to use. Not always. So, think broadly. So we use a lot of very basic cleansers. They're very good at denaturing proteins and breaking that down, particularly. They're also hard on tartrates, because that is a solvent from usually calcium bitartrate. Calcium bitartrate occasionally, but less frequently than calcium bitartrate. Very strong oxidizing agents. So they are, as well as being good at just removing that grime and gunk. They're good at killing organisms as well. They break down organisms. This is why your hands get slippery when you put it into the bases. sometimes, because it's kind of hard on you too. Everybody gets, that's the thing with ozone. It's like, oh yeah, oxidizing all this stuff, wahoo, and then you realize you're standing in ozone gas. It's like, kind of, it's oxidizing you too. You're just a little bigger. These are where you really have to be careful about the concentrations on the proxyclean or sodium percarbonate. That's a little bit more gentle, and it starts as a powder. But when we're talking about things like Excel or liquid cleansers that are potassium hydroxide or sodium hydroxide, those are coming to the winery in very high concentrations, and they will burn you really seriously quite quickly. The same as with lab concentrations of hydrogen peroxide also. 10% hydrogen peroxide is something that's in labs a lot of the time, and those are really serious. Really, I mean, you can get a pretty good burn on your hand just for screwing the lid back on and having there been a little bit of hydrogen peroxide on it. It's wise to use your personal protective devices, goggles, and gloves, and things like that. And this is also where oftentimes the combination of some of these compounds and moving liquid is very useful. So if you're cleaning a tank, the idea of having like a tank ball or something that you're recirculating the tank back up and over the top. So you can use the same cleanser several different times, move it into the one tank, circulate over the top of the tank with a spray ball 10 or 15 times, or for 10 or 15 minutes, and then move it to the next, move the spray ball over the top, fill the next tank up with the other one, and then, go back through with your neutralization or your rinse after that. So especially with things like, proxy or soda ash, things like that, are ones where you can continually kind of move the liquid around. And lots of wineries, they'll just keep those in the winery, and they can test the pH on it. And if your pH is, 11 to 12, something like that, once the pH, you see the pH start to drop, you kind of know that there's that you're kind of neutralized quite a bit of it, but it'll continue to work, and it may look kind of grody, but it'll continue to work. And so usually when I do this for cleaning hoses or something like that, sanitize the hose, you just circulate it for 20 minutes usually is sufficient. And again, we realize that we're not sanitizing here, or we're not sterilizing here, we're sanitizing. So especially like getting the line ready to go to bottle, you're going to have a clean hose, but you're still attaching it to the dirty side of the machine, and there's a break point in the middle, which is the sterile filter. So past the sterile filter, nothing's getting past the sterile filter, assuming the sterile membrane is good, but still, you don't want to have, still want, this idea of maintaining best practices. So even though I know that everything that goes through these hoses is going to go through a sterile filter anyway, it's still best practice to have it as clean as you can get it with your normal practices. There's a lot of, and Scott Lab sells a lot of this stuff actually. Maybe I'll look up the Scott Labs manual really quick. And they're selling a lot of cleansers right now, which is kind of interesting, and they're focusing a lot on what they're calling built cleansers. So they're
can you scoot the screen over and see anything you want?
There you go. So they have a number of different products. So one's just for cleaning barrels, one's both. The exact formulations or all the uses are not necessarily important, but where they're building in some additional buffering rather than just using one chemical, they're using kind of a combination of them. So you use a base for one thing, or some other types of compounds for instance, for cleaning the. For instance, here they're talking about solubilizing minerals. And you'll see this sometimes too, especially in situations where you've got hot or hard water, where you have minerals deposits all over everything, you'll end up using some kind of neutral, and usually just a gentle, relatively low strength acid. I know a lot of people clean stuff. Vinegar, for instance, which is a nice kind of gentle deliming agent. Very strong acids are rarely used in the wine industry. They work, but the problem is that they're also really hard on the furniture, so they'll corrode. I know like etching and things is done, I believe, with nitric acid. So they break down your gaskets really quickly. They'll be very hard. You know, those scratched surfaces will be. Sam, Energy Logistics. Told Lisa that I would keep my phone on in case it was her. So, also they're really, you know, pretty dangerous as well. And the most common acid that we use to clean stuff, unfortunately, I mean, we use peracetic acid, which is it's a different situation. It's a peroxy acid, or basically. But frequently we'll use SO2, like tartaric SO2 solutions or citric SO2 solutions. And those acids themselves, citric acid isn't that dangerous, but when you're adding a lot of citric acid to a fair amount of sodium metabisulfite or potassium metabisulfite, you get a lot of free SO2 gas because you're forcing that reaction to the molecular form. And that can be very dangerous for employees as well. So again, it's a good cleanser, but it's really important to make sure that the people that are working with it understand that they're in, you know, what they're going to be encountering. Give them a safe face mask. So if you know you're having them sanitize hoses for whatever reason with citric sulfur solution, make sure they've got a gas mask that they can use, an acid gas mask. And also with those kinds of personal protective devices like these gas masks, if you're using yours and you can smell anything of the thing that you're trying to avoid, like if you're sulfuring barrels and you can smell SO2, you need to replace those reactive cartridges on the side. As soon as you open those cartridges, they're starting to be used. So even if you haven't done a lot of barrel sulfuring, but they've been open for 3 or 4 months, they're always working. They don't know that they're not, you know, saving your life at that moment. Certainly the airflow going through them is greater when you're in there breathing, but they are a kind of a perishable thing, so it's important. And again, it's not that expensive. It's certainly much cheaper than, you know, hurting yourself, even when you think you're trying to protect yourself. So surfactants, and we'll see a lot of this when you're looking at different kind of built products. And if you read the back of any, you know, laundry detergent or something like that, they'll talk about ionic and anionic surfactants as well, which work kind of like I was describing in the beginning, where we have the more polar end, like we've talked about cell membranes, where you have that phospholipid bilayer, and you've got one end that's very polar, and then their back end, their tail, that's really not very polar. So it's you have soaps, or in some ways, sort of the chemistry of them is quite similar to that sort of thing. And again, these can be really great. And there's some of these built cleansers that are a mix of PeroxyClean and some other surfactants and things like that can do a great job at cleaning. They can stick to the surface of something a little bit better. They can also last a little bit longer because they tend to be a little bit more buffered. Some can be very foamy, which is really nice, especially if you don't have time to do repeated agitations or something. You can spray on a foam solution that can hold there, and then you can, you know, clean it off later on, hose it off to rinse. And really, this idea, we talked about this too, where you're using a tenside, so it's reducing the surface tension. Has anybody seen this welder repairing stainless steel and checking for a leak? They've got this like green, glowed in the dark green, like predator blood kind of looking stuff, where you like spray on the weld, and its surface tension is like 1,000,000 times, it's less than water or something. The guy was explaining to me. He may not have been a scientist, but he was a good welder. But that's exactly what it is. They spray on it, and it will just go right through any unwelded seam. So they test all of the weld seams with it. So they just spray it on this green stuff, and they go out and look on the other side, and it would just pull right through all that, right through any little voids in the space. Kind of cool stuff. The downside of that is sometimes you can get those. You can get that caught up in some of those cracks, into some of those corners, and where normal rinse water has too high a surface tension to get back at it. Yet where, for instance, things are different with wine sometimes as well. The chemistry could be different. So it's, in general, what you really want is to be able to get a thorough deep clean, but to be able to neutralize it and clean it up completely. And this is where rinsing comes in. So oftentimes, like for me, I'll just empty our hoses and then go directly into the peracetic acid for the neutralizing cycle. Probably it would be really good to rinse it if you have fresh water. This is where, again, it's nice to have the water filter system with a hose so that you have some idea that you're capturing any microbes that might be existing in the water. Certainly a bucket of water. This was a practice that was very common at the winery when I got there, was that, okay, we go from the peroxy to the peracetic with a water rinse in the middle. But a bucket of water has been sitting there for a day and a half. We know what's living in there, which is everything that was on the hoses the first time we put them into the peroxy thing. So it's nice to I find that if you are rinsing something with water, my practice is you take a sanitized bucket, fill it with water from the filter on the tap if you can, and chase that through so you know you're at least starting with as clean of water as possible to get at it. Because big buckets of water that just sit at the winery are always big buckets of microbial soup better than inside your hoses that you just cleaned. So again, it's just one of those things. Think about this before, and start practices and implement practices that are really going to do a good job at preventing things from growing more. Once you've done a rinse cycle, then usually they'll go into a sort of a neutralizing system, so that even if you did have a little bit of residual caustic, you would use, if you were using potassium hydroxide or sodium hydroxide, then use a weak acid to neutralize that, and that can work really well. Again, with most acids, we're talking about microbes that survive in environments that are high in acid and very low in pH, like wine. So it's not very difficult to believe that inside your citric acid or tartaric acid bucket that there are happily surviving microbes that you wouldn't really want back in your wine again, which is why we use peracetic, peroxyacetic acid as a neutralizer, because it is both a hydrogen peroxide sanitizer and it is a very weak acid. So the chemists can explain this, but again, it neutralizes bases to basically 7, kind of pH of neutral water. So it's a good solution. It's not cheap, but it's quite a good solution for both for sanitizing and for neutralizing your bases. Also, it's important that I just really advise against using citric acid as a final rinse cycle because of all of the things that can be happily living in citric acid, but also everything that lives on citric acid. Certainly, volatile acidity producing microbes, things like that.
So, could you? I'm having trouble tracking a little bit. So, if you were going to sanitize a miscellaneous pump and a couple of hoses, what's your protocol for that?
My protocol is we have a brute garbage can of peroxy and a brute garbage can of peracetic acid. You put your little tester strip in the peracetic acid. You check to make sure that it's sufficiently strong. You put your hoses into the pump, or you assemble your pump hose thing. Stick the hoses into the peroxy circuit for, I say, 20 minutes, but usually 15 to 20 minutes are just fine. Often it's good practice to go forwards and backwards, so you kind of change the flow a little bit. And then what I'll do is I'll take one end out of the pull end out, and push through until it's bubbling, and then stick it them both into the paracetic. Or I will put, wait till it's empty, put the other end into the, put the pull end again into the paracetic, pull out the other end, and feel with my fingers because it'll transition from slippery base to more neutralized once you're pushing paracetic out, and then I'll put that end to sacrifice a little bit of it to keep the big majority of it. Yeah, exactly. And then you'll do that, and these sanitizers, surface sanitizers, they work very, very quickly. So oftentimes we'll circuit for 3 or 4 minutes, but by that point, usually we're going to store the pump, or just leave it there. It'll be done for the day. So then we'll leave it with the paracetic in the lines into the pump. So for cleaning tanks and stuff, we'll try using hot water for particularly for tartrates, because that does a great job. Hot water and pressure. Or if it's just a tank that we have line in and now it's empty, we'll hose it out. Then we'll apply with the sprayer, we'll spray peroxy on the inside, all the surfaces on the inside. Let that sit for, oftentimes if it's still dirty, like especially if you just wrapped out of that tank at harvest and there's, there's some proteins and things like that in there, letting that sit for a couple of minutes while the peroxy is kind of working on it. Then hose that out, rinse it out, and then go over the entire surface with paracetic acid, and that's a sanitizer. Like in the brewing industry, they drain the paracetic acid out, but they don't water rinse, and then they just go in with water on top of that. I always rinse the paracetic out, but it denatures basically to hydrogen peroxide, which then turns to water and oxygen and acetic acid, or acetate technically, the ion. So it works very, very well. So I rinse it out. But if you're not using the tank immediately, I just leave the sanitizer on it. And then after I know that it's been cleaned and we're about to use it again, if it's been a few days, I'll go back. We'll put paracetic acid back, so re-sanitize the surface for anything that's kind of moved in the last few days, and then go ahead and rinse it out, and then come on. Again, we're not sterilizing it. We're just always trying to reduce the populations that we can control as well as we can, and then moving on to rerunning doing what you were starting to do in the first place. Just try not to make anything worse. So once we're done cleaning it, so with these detergents, we've removed all of the dirt and deposits and stuff on the surface. Then we can go about using a sanitizer. Oftentimes people will use sanitizer, or some of these as sanitizers as well, but then you're still in the same problem with neutralization. So something that's pH 14 is very hard on, or pH 11 or 12 is very hard on microbes. And then we'll go into using different kinds of sanitizers. So we're not going to talk again about the bases as much, but we'll talk more about the other compounds that are being used right now. Again, we have to choose. We're not using steam. We're using chemicals. Basically, we're not irradiating it or something. So we're killing most things, but we're not killing everything. And really, when we know what we're trying, there's a couple of these sanitizers that we'll talk about that work very well on specific organisms, or specific types of organisms, and others that are much more broad spectrum. And then most of the time, there's, with the exception of paracetic, where they say, well, you can just go right in on top of it. No, I don't. And for me, the big reason for that is, even if the VA is very small, there is still peroxide in there. So you do have, peroxide will oxidize ethanol, turn you into ethyl or acetaldehyde, and then that'll bind with your SO2. So and actually H2O2 will work. I think it still has to produce the aldehyde to bind with the SO2. But so it's one of those things where any of these things, I just try and keep other stuff out. So a little bit of rinsing is probably fine. This is from chapter 11. It's a kind of a nice little list of the different compounds that we're going to talk about. Iodine-based cleansers, quaternary ammonia, peroxyacetic acid, peracetic acid, it's the same thing. Acidulated SO2, and ozone, which we don't go very far into ozone, but it's being able to have an ozone generator is kind of nice. I don't know very much about iodine cleansers. I haven't used them. Certainly iodine taps and things like that for cleaning stuff. That we know it works to clean water and things like that. Like usually use iodine and phosphoric acid, so the phosphoric acid is good for that mineral cleaning like we were talking about before. And they work well, from what I've read, in lower concentrations. So I think when you're talking about bleach, you're talking about, I think they were talking about a 200 part per million solution of chlorine to kill something, whereas iodine works in a much lower concentration, 30 or 40 parts per million. A nice thing about so iodine is a good one because it's easy. There's lots of tests where we use iodine as an indicator. And it's easy to test for the presence or absence of iodine, so it's nice that you can just get a test strip and check to see whether it's still working or not. Also, it's very nice, the same thing is nice about peracetic acid, where you can say, this bucket of peracetic acid, it looks good, but it's been sitting here a week. How clean is it? And you take your little test strip and stick it in there, and if it turns a certain shade of gray or black, then you know you're fine. Or if it's a little light, you have to augment it before you're actually doing anything by using it. Too often, you find that it's a big dirty bucket of water, and if there's really no peracetic in there, it's best to just dump it out, clean the bucket, and start over again. Similar to things like SO2, iodine is volatile when it gets very hot. This is hotter than just warm tap water, but if you're using that in really hot water, it gets quite volatile, so you can have a lot of loss when we're talking about using iodine with really warm water. So a quaternary ammonia compound is a charged nitrogen molecule. So it has, since nitrogen really only wants to have 3 covalent bonds, when it has 4, it generates gets a positive charge. You see we have 4 carbon molecules that are attached to it, and this works into you have this long tail here, which is very disruptive of cell walls, and kind of hard on different kinds of organisms, or cell membranes. But so this is different than the kind of ammonia when you're just using ammonia in your Windex or something cleaning your glass. Although that has some antiseptic properties, this is a lot stronger. So as with normal ammonia, these are just hydrogen molecules. In quaternary ammonia compounds, you'll have 4 carbon molecules or alkyl groups that are attached to them. It was just if people were awake. It's very hard on microbial cell membranes because of those long nonpolar tails, in the same way that long chain fatty acids are really hard on cell membranes. We were talking about that when we came to fermentation difficulties. And it's very hard on gram-positive bacteria, so lactic acid bacteria. We talked about Enococcus, Pediococcus, and Lactobacillus. Unfortunately, it doesn't work as well against Acetobacter. So it goes. And it's very good on mold, so this is a good solution perhaps for that grime on the other side of tanks, or not inside the tank, but where you have, for instance, dripping off onto the floor. This happens a lot, especially where you have, you're cold stabilizing, your tank is constantly sweating and dripping onto the side, and then you notice that you've got kind of a slimy, black, moldy situation going on there. So, and I know that it's particularly with sponges and things like that, where you start to get kind of funny aromatics, little quaternary ammonia on a sponge that's used to wipe down counters or towels or something like that. Can be good to clear that. And there's some, I wondered about this, on outsides of barrels and stuff, if it would work. I haven't found anything like that. But a lot of these surfaces, because that which isn't used immediately, it has some residual effect. So it can be kind of preventing further growth for a little while. Again, I don't use any of these just because it's not in stuff that we use, but I've thought about it certainly for when we have these kind of nasty concrete situations which have a lot of microbial snot on them. We talked about this as well, acidulated SO2. So SO2, a strong SO2 solution, which then you add a bunch of acid to drive the chemistry over to the gas form of SO2 or molecular SO2. And it is, like we talked about the other day, where at 1 milligram of molecular SO2, you can kill a lot of organisms. The exception of, what do we see, was like Zygosaccharomyces or something that had a 3 molecular or 5 molecular or something like that. So you'd be dead long before Zygosaccharomyces. But in situations where you've really got a pretty strong acidic solution, and then you add SO2 to it, that gives you a very high molecular SO2 right away, and that's very, very hard on, because it turns into so much gets into the cell walls that there's a lot of charge changes and a lot of reaction that occurs inside of the microbial cells. Again, I would use, even though citric acid is very cheap, I would use tartaric just because it's a lot less frequently metabolized. But again, you always know about it when you stick. And a lot of winemakers don't know the chemistry. This is why I focus on this chemistry in the Intro to Wine Science class as well, because when you come into a situation, it's like, oh yeah, I was adding acid to all this SO2. I'm like, oh my goodness. It's like, well, thinking back on this, and I've had relatively famous winemakers look at me and go, do you know why it goes like that? I'm like, oh. Like, why your eyes are bleeding? Yeah, I know why. And this is another one. Now, I have made this mistake where you have like the little jug of SO2 solution sitting on the shelf. Don't smell it.
Yeah, I wonder if this is still good.
Wonder if this is still good. And I'm like out like grabbing pine needles and trying to see if I can like smell them and like blood coming out. I'm like, oh my god, Francis, stupid. So my first name is Francis, and when I'm in trouble, my wife calls me Francis. Francis. Drew. Did anybody take like police officer Drew? He's like 9 feet tall. He was in classes over in the old building. He works for Guardian now, and he's just like this enormous guy. Oh, makes me feel bad even now. So yeah, gas masks, please. Peroxides. So again, this is where we're talking about H2O2 can be very good, and that's really what's the active agent in a lot of these compounds. Peroxyclean. But if you want, you can use this. It breaks down very, very quickly, so that's another bad if you're trying to maintain it for long periods of time. But it's good in terms of it, not when you touch the rinse water or something like that. It's not going to burn your hands off. The most famous, and this works really, really well. And I think if you're going to have one thing around, not just because it's what I have around, and I'm interested in looking at some of these more built cleaner compounds because I think that there's probably some benefit to that. But peroxyclean is relatively inexpensive. It doesn't break down to a huge amount of totally nasty stuff. I mean, I don't want to pour it down a storm drain or something, but it's at least not one of those things where, like potassium hydroxide or sodium hydroxide, where the pH is really, really very high. This is something that at normal winery concentrations, you can touch it. It's in color safe bleach. It's in all sorts of household products. I mean, OxyFresh. I don't know what the little blue things are, but all the other stuff is this stuff. So it's a good solution for really cleaning stuff, and does a nice job breaking stuff down. And I find, very broadly successful in keeping stuff clean. But yeah, I mean, that's what we used to clean everything. In Oregon, we would occasionally clean stuff with really hardcore cleansers where you would spray it on there and there would be a lot less scrubbing involved. except that you're spraying like pH 13 stuff all over the place or pH 12 stuff all over the place, which to me is just like, everybody's standing there in this mist of like whatever they're spraying. And I'm like, I would much rather have that be peroxy and scrub a little bit harder than something that's insanely dangerous and just have, you know, some tired person actually overspray and spray somebody with it. Try to avoid these things. Peracetic acid is also peroxide, so there's H2O2 in peracetic acid. If you're in Woodinville and you would like to buy some of this, my good friend Erica sells it. Not to put too many plugs in for her business, but great at lab. And they also, she does all of the breaking down of this, so she buys it in big jugs and houses it down into smaller stuff. And it's a terrible thing. I'm glad I don't have to do it. So also it's nice. You can use it as a neutralizer, which is great because it is, you know that what you are neutralizing in is also a sanitizer, so you're not putting a bunch of microbes back onto your stuff when you're neutralizing, so that's quite good. And it's very easy to test. Yeah, go ahead.
Can you use that as a one-step? I mean,
It doesn't have the same ability to, the same kind of grime defeating stuff. So there's other stuff, like the sanitizer oxidizing agent in proxy, and seems to, I mean, it may have a lot of the same, like hydrogen peroxide, which both of these things produce, but the much higher pH and the other is a little bit, I think is better. It more effectively removes the organics. So you just, I mean, I tried this where you just don't get it as clean. If you put it in the proxy first, scrub it off, and then you neutralize it in the sanitizer. It's really good. So, because oxidizing agents and bases aren't the same, so proxy is a basic, so it does produce something. Again, please wear your goggles. Yeah.
According to these last slides, we don't actually sanitize here in our winery. Right?
You do sanitize, but you don't sterilize. I mean, I assume, well, I don't know, what do you do?
Well, I mean, it's just proxy. Well, water, proxy, water, citric.
water.
Yeah.
So, I mean, none of those were sanitizers.
They're proxy. I mean, proxy is a strong oxidizing agent. So, I mean, you will, I mean, and that will disrupt all sorts of chemistry. But it is, yeah, I mean, you're not using a final sanitizing step. You're assuming that it's both cleaning and sanitizing at the same time. I mean, the way we do it is we have the base, and then we'll do a rinse, and then we'll use a sanitizer.
Okay.
But, I mean, it's certainly better than nothing. I'm very suspicious about spraying tartaric acid or citric acid all over things. I'm probably too worried about that, but I mean, there's a lot of one-step cleansers that are just, I mean, I think you can buy the cleanser called one-step at
Yeah,
home
and
stores,
proxy
and that is
is
just proxy and rinse it off.
Right.
Just wait for it to, turn into, you rinse off the base part, you add enough water to it, functionally carrying away the basic part, and then the hydrogen peroxide just breaks down.
So it sounds like there's a lot of squish room in a lot of these as far as their function.
Yeah,
A lot
there's
of
some
those are a lot of
utility.
things.
Yeah, exactly. But it's harder to make it go back the other way. So you don't clean stuff with a sanitizer, you clean it with a cleanser and then sanitize it. I mean, so some of these sanitizers, yes, you can use it as something that kills things, but you have to have cleaned it in the first place. But something like peracetic acid or something is a little more just to clean to sanitize it. But we're on the other side, we have better cleansers. So, I mean, for instance, if you had, like I'll do this with the decanters in the tasting room or the tasting pour spouts or something like that. It's great. You put it in proxy, fill a pitcher up with proxy, throw it all in there, or fill up the decanters with it. It's great for decolorizing. It'll break down whatever sludge and dehydrated junk that's in there. And then I'll just use it as a neutralizing function. I'll dump it all out. I'll run it. Make sure that we get peracetic in there. Not because, I mean, you don't really worry that your decanter's sterile or something like that. But then neutralize and then rinse it off. And, yeah, it's very good. But where you have to have that initial step for breaking down the color and taking out the gunk that kind of gets in. I mean, Some pour spouts can look pretty gross after. Yeah, I love that too. You go into go to these wineries where they have clearly the coffee cup that has 27,000 cups of coffee in it, where they just left and then the wine glasses are oh my god, they're orange. It's like, this is a beautiful wine. It's like, it's orange. I don't know. I can't see through the wall of the glass. So I should have said that effective sanitizers, not cleansers, because hot water can work very well, and having a little more energy in it, when things are moving around a bit faster. Hot water and steamer are really very good at this. I know. Peter likes steam. I would love to have a steam generator for barrels. I think maybe the best way to clean barrels. Although ozone people are liking ozone as well. But I think they have some barrel refreshers that are used, but a lot of the time they say, first steam for 5 minutes, then use our barrel refresh, and then steam for another 5 minutes. It's like, oh, okay, it's a 3-step recipe that involves 2 things that you're not telling me. So it can be kind of like, well, what's really doing the work here? Steam it until the outside of the barrel can fry an egg. That'll be perfect. But it's very hard. You're not going to get down into those pores, so basically you just have to kind of cook everything in position, because you're really not going to, when you have microbes that weasel their way into the wood, you're really not going to get it out very well. It is also very hard, especially in lines and pipes and things like that, fixed pipes, and these are almost always problems when wineries or companies that do cellar audits basically go into places that have microbial problems. They'll find, frequently they'll find that handy thing that lets you, shoot wine up and over the door with 4 corners on it that have never seen the light of day, and then they scope up in there and it's like, oh yeah, there's garbage that's where you get your biofilm or your tartrate or whatever. So a lot of places will have a stainless steel hose that will go up and over, or pipes throughout the building. And some of these enormous wineries where they go in there and they've got a bank of 20 different hose outs coming in that are hardwired into the wall. It goes into the concrete. It goes back into a corner, and it's very hard to effectively clean those, especially with sometimes you'll be able to use things like pigs, where you can blast, they call it a pig, a little orange sponge, functionally, that you start at one end and push through with compressed air oftentimes, and they'll get some scrubbing and agitation, but it's very hard to clean that stuff. So you can do what you can with chemistry, but still frequently you're leaving space in there for organisms to colonize, and then, which is why regular use of steam or very hot water can be great, because again, it's dirt, but it's clean dirt. It's at least been thoroughly cooked, so it doesn't solve the problem that it's a place for things to hang up and live later, but at least you know that you have killed whatever was living in there at that point. I don't use any pigs. I think I would like some, just to give you a little more scrubbing action inside your hoses, so you can pack it in there and blast it through with compressed air or nitrogen or something like that. Where the name for this comes from the oil industry. So they clean out oil lines. They use the original pigs. Now the modern ones have little oil pipeline things they go through, and they check for leaks and they look for damage. But originally, 50 years ago, it was just a bale of hay wrapped in barbed wire, and they'd shoot it through the lining, all the way across Alaska. Thank God for NPR. I would not be able to know that. Send money to KOW. Yeah, so heat works great, and there's a lot of places you just can't get to, especially bottling lines. There's little parts in the back. So steam is very, very common for that, and you just heat it up.
The heater just turned on, huh?
The heater turned on, and then the fan for the...
Now it's trying to cool itself down.
Yeah, exactly. It's making us hotter again. We have 2 heaters now. Oh.
Yeah.
We used to have to do it with the pins in the old building, we'd set ice bags up on top of it. Yeah, Bruce Watson, he used to teach this class, he said he would always tell about this story. Like, he remembers that he had heard that they had broken down an entire barrel and basically autoclaved it to get rid of, because this is always the thing, is there an effective way of getting rid of Brettanomyces once it's in a winery and in the cooperage in the winery? And it's really, it's very, very difficult. It's not very cost effective to break all your barrels down, or even just, you know, one barrel at a time. It's gigantic.
And those rewind guys claim that their process does it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they're shaving off a fair amount of wood on the inside of this.
And then heating it again.
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe. I wouldn't, I mean, I just, again, I'm kind of throwing up my hands. And I'm like, I don't think barrels are clean. I mean, I think they're very hard to clean. They're difficult to sanitize, and they're probably impossible to sterilize unless you light it on fire. But I mean, it's so kind of problematic. Maybe radiation, and there are some people that are using UV, so they're putting a UV probe in there and then using a lot of UV light. Again, how far does that penetrate into the wood? Not far. I mean, and who's gonna, like, who wants to be the poor fellow that gets to nuke all your barrels? For when that, I mean, I know they do this with meat and with spices and things like that. There's a lot of treatments with reducing radiation. I haven't found that happening.
It might be an interesting, you know, we've got this big Hanford out there in eastern Washington. Maybe there can be a secondary industry.
Right.
Barrel sterilization at Hanford.
We'll call it background. Yeah. You can tell which one of our barrels.
This barrel was dipped in tank 4.
Right. Yeah. Ouch. I've been in, so Sagemore Vineyard looks right down onto Hanford, and I've been out there when they had like some kind of alarm, which turned out it was, I mean, it was like, you know, it wasn't even like we were that close to ripeness, you know, I could have gone another day, you know, like, standing out there at this apartment, and we're both a little bit like, oh. And it's like, seriously, you can hear it all the way from across the river, and then like 5 minutes later, it's like, this is good fast. It's like, oh my God.
They always say that.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, you see these guys like running, they're like, oh, they're just practicing running for their lives. I guess that's what every jogger you see in Tri-Cities is just practicing running for their lives. So yeah, so a lot of pieces of equipment. I've heard that at, well actually, here, at Opus 1, they sanitize barrel thieves this way. So you have a number of different barrel thieves, like just sitting in a pot, basically boiling water, pushing through the winery, and then I guess they must do something to cool it off. And between, you know, going back to forth the barrel, they just stick it in the boiling water, pull it out, put it, maybe they've got ice water or something, I really don't know. But that will keep things clean. I do a bucket of paracetic and a bucket of water, sanitize and paracetic, and then rinse between barrels most of the time, just to prevent cross-contaminating barrels. So all of the bottling line guys are using, usually it's steam. Some places have, but steam is a lot more effective, and it gets hotter and it's a lot more efficient because you're using a lot less water for sure. When I was at Woodhouse, we had about 2 huge hot water tanks that were designed in like $75,000 worth of water heaters that were like 98% efficient water heaters. And it was great to have freakishly hot water on tap sometimes, except when you get it on your pants and then your pants are then 180 degrees, that kind of thing. The woman that replaced me actually hurt herself doing that. And it's one of those things, like, the downside of heat is that it's like instantaneously dangerous, and steam is even more dangerous because it can be a lot hotter than boiling water. Boiling water is plenty hot enough. So it's very, very important to be safe there. Bottling lines where you're trying, basically you're getting to the most distant point, is what you're doing is you're starting at the beginning, you're pushing steam all the way through, and then at all of these different points you're testing to make sure that they got up to at least 180 degrees at that point. And then is, of course, the filler spout, the most distant, and in fact beyond the filler spout, it's very important, is the leveler. So the bottling leveler that you come off the bottling with a certain, off the filler line with a certain amount of wine, you'll run through the leveler, which will push out whatever additional amount of wine goes in there, so you get a very consistent level. It goes into every single bottle. It has to be sanitized. It has to be sterilized. And then the corker jaws. So the cork, which you serve down into the bottle, comes packed in SO2. The corker bowl has to be sanitized, and the corker jaws that's doing the squeezing has to be sanitized as well, has to be sterilized as well. And that is often done with heat and then done with a lot of depending on how usually I see
So those corkers, though, I've always wondered.
and they have some that have elements inside of them.
I mean, you pop the lid open halfway through, you dump more corks in there. You sort of blew your sterilization in your hopper.
As long as you're not like directly putting your hands in there, like it is that's an acceptable. Yeah, absolutely. It is an approved practice, though. I guess at least. All these guys are doing that. Yeah. I don't know if larger wineries are using larger bags of corks or have larger hoppers. I think there are some places also that have the element that they clean up into the top too, but they're not steaming out the corker bowl. But there's always downsides. But that one is proved not to be. Let's. I don't think it's very good.